EWTN. This is Open Line. In North America, call toll-free 1-800-585-9396. That's 1-800-585-9396. Outside North America, call 1-205-271-2985. You can also send an email to openline@ewtn.com.
Hey, happy Friday to each and every one of you. We are coming to you live from the Shrine of the Most Blessed Sacrament in Hanceville, Alabama. Well, actually, we're not.
No, we're not.
We're not, but Colin, you and I are at the shrine right now.
Yes, that's quite possibly true, because today is the EWTN Employee Retreat. We have Father Brett Brannon to kick off Lent from Savannah, Georgia, over to do the retreat for us. So it will be a day of blessing, and hence our pre-tape of the program for Friday.
So this is a very special mailbag edition of EWTN's Open Line Friday, so no phone calls, please. Colin will be answering your emails most of the program, so we will not give out the phone numbers. But
and for the rest of the program, Jack will be answering the emails.
You know what? I can answer some of these emails. Not all of them, but I can answer some of them. I am Jack Williams. The lovely and talented Elena Rodriguez is your producer, and Matt Gabinski is lining up a couple phone calls that we had left over from the previous program, and we will take a couple of those if we can get them lined up and ready to go. Colin, are you in the starting blocks and ready to roll?
I am.
All right,
down on all fours.
Lisa
go ahead.
in Houston, Texas writes in, hello and God bless. Is there any benefit to a holy hour online? I've seen some live webcam adoration chapels, and while I know it would not replace being there in person, I was wondering if the hour would be better spent doing something else, quote-unquote, Catholic. Thank you for this program and all the helpful answers. Keep up the good work. That's Lisa in Houston, Texas.
Sure. I would say it has the same benefit to piety as would watching a Mass. We watch the Holy Father, he's live, or watch the daily Mass here at Our Lady of the Angels Chapel. It's live, but you're not present. You're not participating in the Mass. You're not making a holy hour in the presence of our Lord, and therefore you can't get the plenary indulgence for doing that. But it's an exercise of piety, and you pray. The image you are seeing of the consecrated species, of course, is the sacramental sign of Christ's presence. That has to have some value. And if that motivates you to profound prayer, and that's what's possible for you in your circumstances to do that, think of the homebound, then that is a blessing and an opportunity for grace for the individual. But we never want to mistake the actual adoration or the actual participation in Mass for what is at best a substitute, and that is watching, listening on TV or over the internet. So whether it's useful in comparison with other things, I think anything that gets us to love our Lord, to adore and praise and glorify Him, to make supplication, give thanksgiving, and so on, the various acts of contrition, any of those things are useful in the spiritual life, even though they're, you might say, in some sense, they're second best to other actual participations in liturgies or in adoration.
And Mark in England writes, do you recommend receiving on the tongue or over the hand?
I do, because I agree with Bishop Schneider, who wrote a wonderful book called Dominus Es, and it turns out that he was able to convince an important personage in Rome, the former Cardinal Ratzinger, when he was Pope, that the patristic text did not demonstrate that communion in the hand is often argued was the practice of the early church. Because what he said, what they did was they didn't feed themselves. The hands were used as sort of an altar, a cloth, or something else was placed over them, and then the host was consumed out of the hand. It wasn't a case of self-communication with the fingers. And so I think there's a lot of arguments in favor of that. I think it motivated the former Pope, the Pope Emeritus, to change some of the practices that he himself was involved with as to who he would give communion and how, kneeling and on the tongue. And I think this is given as an example, not as a force to the church, you must do it this way, but as an example of a best practices. And I firmly believe in that as a best practice.
Let's go to the telephone right now, Colin. We've got a caller that has held on to talk to you. It's Judy in Lake Charles, Louisiana. She's listening to EWTN on Sirius XM Channel 130. Judy, what's your question for Colin?
I am a divorced Catholic. I've been divorced for 27 years. And during that time, I have still continued to go to church. And my question is, I am in the process of getting an annulment, but they take so long. Mm-hmm. And I really would like to know if you foresee us Catholics or the church streamlining the annulment process so that we can get back to the sacraments more easily.
Mm-hmm. Well, you don't say whether you're remarried, but of course, if you are not you are. Okay.
I am remarried.
You are remarried, so there is the obstacle to getting back to
another
sacraments.
Obstacle I have is my husband is not as devout as I am. I mean, as far as church going.
Sure. So you're fighting a sort of an uphill battle there.
Yes.
Well, the Pope has in fact attempted to do this. I just read something today. He met, of course, last year in early September. He issued a motu proprio directing, not simply suggesting a commission or something, to simplify the process of annulment so that they would be just, they would be in accordance with the truth, but that they would be procedurally much more easier to navigate than has been historically in the church since the reform of the Code of Canon Law in the 80s. So that is an ongoing process. What I saw today that was unique to that is that the Roman Rota, the church's highest marriage tribunal, has produced what they call a vade mecum, a take with me document that is, I guess, being sent to bishops and canonists at some point around the world, which gets into that in a certain level of detail to help the dioceses put this into practice. So there are already some things that the Pope did that I won't say liberalized, because that suggests that you get an unjustified annulment. That's not what the church's objective is. But to regularize honestly, but also quickly as possible, people in your situation who have grounds for a true declaration of nullity, so that they can, in all moral honesty, return to the sacraments. And so that is ongoing. So you might check the Catholic press today for what the Pope said, especially the Register, obviously, and Catholic News Agency, to see what the Pope did in speaking with the cardinals today and the discussion that they had in that respect, because I think that process is moving forward.
You've been most helpful, and I do just want you to know that I do enjoy the EWTN program. It's helped me out considerably in my faith, in my journey of faith, and also just for the fact that the church is a caring.
Well, thank you, and you help us out too, because you affirm what we hope to be true and not always know is true, that we're actually helping people along the way, as you mentioned. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Judy. You'll be in our prayers, and your husband as well, there in Lake Charles, Louisiana. We're just getting started on a very special mailbag edition of EWTN's Open Line Friday with EWTN's Vice President of Theology, Mr. Colin Donovan. No phone calls today, please. We'll be answering your emails with Colin. More of that straight ahead. Open Line Friday with Colin Donovan.
This is a Lenten Journey with Timothy Cardinal Dolan on EWTN Radio.
We adore thee, O Christ, and we praise thee, because by thy holy cross thou hast redeemed the world. Fridays are always important for us as Catholics, as we reverently and gratefully recall the passion and death of Jesus on the cross. Fridays during Lent are especially important to everybody, and there's two ways that Holy Mother Church encourages us to observe these Fridays. Number one is an intensified spirit of penance and sacrifice. The Church asks us to abstain from meat in Lent. And a second beautiful custom to do during Lent are the Stations of the Cross, as we follow Jesus on the Via Crucis, the road to Calvary. We're getting ready for Good Friday during Lent. TGIF, thank God it's Friday, the day of our salvation.
A Lenten Journey with Timothy Cardinal Dolan is available on DVD through the EWTN Religious Catalog. This DVD includes all 47 segments for each day of Lent, from Ash Wednesday to Easter Sunday. To get your copy, log on to our website, EWTNReligiousCatalog.com, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, or call 1-800-854-6316.
Podcasts of Open Line are available within 24 hours of live broadcast. Go to EWTN.com and click on Multimedia.
This is Janet Benkovic, host of Women of Grace.
Hello, this is Cardinal Donald Wuerl of the Archdiocese of Washington.
This is Gloria Purvis, host of Morning Glory. Thanks for listening to the EWTN Global Catholic Radio Network.
This is Open Line on the EWTN Global Catholic Radio Network. If you have a question or comment, call 1-800-585-9396. Outside North America, call 1-205-271-2985 or send an email to openline@ewtn.com.
Be sure to like EWTN Radio on Facebook. Go to facebook.com/EWTN Radio Network. Next up is a question here from Mike on our special mailbag edition of EWTN's Open Line Friday with Colin Donovan. No phone calls today, please. Mike in Richardson, Texas writes in, is it a sin for a Catholic to not be confirmed? The Baltimore Catechism says it is, but the latest catechism is not explicit. I'm currently in RCIA, but my wife is a cradle Catholic, though she was never confirmed. She's been a practicing Catholic all her life. I think it was more of an oversight in her family because none of her brothers or sisters were confirmed either. That's Mike in Richardson, Texas.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the church can say categorically that it is a sin. I think one has to weigh the reasons why the Baltimore Catechism might say that. First of all, confirmation is the completion of the sacraments of initiation. You know, not that baptism doesn't make you a Catholic, a Christian, united to Christ, and so on. Not that the Eucharist is not, you know, the most noble of the sacraments that we could possibly receive. But in the three together, with the chrismating as well as in baptism and the Eucharist, which is normally the completion of the two earlier ones, we are fully initiated. So there is something deficient in those who are not fully initiated in the church. Doesn't mean they can't get to heaven. Doesn't mean they're not going to get grace by receiving, you know, penance and anointing of the sick, and the marriage and the other sacraments, the Eucharist, of course. But yes, I think as a goal, every adult Catholic who is aware that they have not been confirmed should put it on their short list, hopefully not a bucket list, but on a short list to get done. And I don't know, it can be done at the Easter Vigil, even if you are not being received into the church. I don't know how parishes would necessarily do that. It could be done privately also by the pastor. So I think that ought to be on the list because of the good it represents in the spiritual life of the person, and because I think it's becoming more and more evident today that we must rely upon the power of the Holy Spirit to have the inner gumption, if you will, to oppose the very socially, culturally, and naturally deviant things going on in our cultures, from the culture of death and abortion and body part selling of fetuses and so on. You go through the list of things to the abomination, which is the distortion of what marriage is, and all of the things that are similar to that in gender ideology. If we are going to stand our ground as Christians, we need all the helps that we can get. And Christ gave us the sacrament of confirmation for a reason. And so therefore we have a reason to celebrate it if we have not already been confirmed. So I will back off of saying it's a sin, but I would say that it is such a necessary good that it ought to be pursued with all of one's energy.
All right, and Dan writes in, I was at Mass the other day, and this priest at his homily said, Jesus was a baby, and gradually he became to realize he was God. But the Catechism, number 473, says, therefore Christ always knew he was the Son of God. Jesus knew he was the Son of God from all eternity, and his human intellect was aware of that fact from the moment of the incarnation, the hypostatic union. So, did Jesus know he was God from the first moment of his incarnation? And that's Dan asking that question.
I'll give the short answer that Fulton Sheen always gives. There were one who and two whats in Christ. The one who is the second person of the Trinity. Does a who know who he is? Yes. The two whats were divine and human. That's all you need to know for this question. From the very moment of his conception as a single cell in the womb of Mary, the divine intellect was capable of infusing into the human soul, where the material processes, the brain, and all, were not present. But the intellect of a human being was. And therefore, even the human intellect, we need to presume from the moment of conception, was capable of receiving the knowledge. So whether just divinely or even humanly in his human intellect, we must take it that Christ always knew he was the second person of the Trinity, and he always knew that he had become incarnate, and he always knew why he had become incarnate, as God obviously must know, and so on and so forth. So I am sure, assuming all goodwill on the part of homilists who fairly regularly make these kinds of knucklehead statements, assuming all goodwill, this is wrapped up with some of the most basic decisions of the church in the early centuries regarding the nature of the Trinity and the nature of the incarnation in Jesus Christ. Let it go, fathers. It just ain't true.
Well, there you have it. Mason writes in, if a priest says all the right words and performs all the correct actions for consecration, but does not actually believe in or personally will the transubstantiation, would the parish receive unconsecrated hosts or be duped into thinking they are receiving Jesus? Or would the miracle take place regardless of the priest's intent? And that's Mason.
The short answer is regardless. And here's why. The power that is given to the priest, the authority to say, this is my body, this is my blood, and to know infallibly that God will do that Christ will become present, is now part of his nature. Once a priest, always a priest, according to the order of Melchizedek, as the ordination ritual gives us. That way you can compare the power of ordaining, or the power of consecrating, say with the natural powers. We know that people can walk, and I maintain they can even talk without really using their brain. They just go and they do it.
I don't like the way you look at me when you say that.
But I wasn't thinking of you.
Okay.
So the priest can, by routinely even doing what the church has asked him to do, whether he has lost faith or has doubts regarding what he has to do. It would be sort of like a person who in a dreamlike state or as a sleepwalker gets out of bed. They are clueless. They may not even be making a positive command, feet walk, but they're doing it. And so the priest can go through the motions absent-mindedly and still accomplish it. He can even cease to believe that he has the power to do it and accomplish it. The one thing he may not do, and I've heard this being done one time, is the priest may not say, I refuse to do that hocus pocus stuff. Putting his will, that's like saying, I can walk, but I refuse to walk. I can do X, but I refuse to do X. That decision of will places a power that God can't do away with, because he respects our will. And so only when a priest wills to reject this office, this task given him by the church, he can go through it routinely, absent-mindedly. He can get to the second half of the Eucharistic prayer and want, did I say the words of consecration? And the people say, yes, Father, you did. It's consecrated, But when he says, I will not consecrate, I don't do that hocus pocus, then that is the situation in which you might as well get up from your pews because you're not going to have a Mass that day. And I've heard of that actually being done on one occasion in one of the American dioceses. A long time ago now. A long time ago.
Far, far away.
And far, far away.
AJ writes in, what should I do to prepare my sister for the salvation of her soul? She was baptized Catholic, sent her 3 sons in the Catholic schools practicing their faith, but not her. She was diagnosed with lymph node cancer. Is it possible for her to receive the sacraments?
Well, anybody...
Not as much information in there as you would like.
No, true, but almost anybody can come into the church if they're not Catholic, or return to the church if they're Catholic and have not practiced on their deathbed. A lot of the obstacles, if you think about it, fall away. You're in an invalid marriage. You've got this. You're harboring this grudge against the church or against a particular priest that offended you at some point in life, or a doctrinal difference or a moral theology difference with the church. All of those things tend to melt away. The dying who have married outside the church and not in valid marriages, well, at that point it's pretty easy to renounce the things you have to renounce in order to be, you're simply not going to do those things again because of your condition. You can return to the church. So I think it ought to be an inducement to those who have fallen away, in the waning days, weeks, months of their life as they're trying to get their life together, to make that reconciliation without regard to those external things. Obviously being prepared to renounce what is a sinful obstacle to that reconciliation, such as sexual practice within a marriage that is not valid. So that being the case, by all means, encourage your sister, meet with a priest, even if she isn't interested in the sacraments. Investigate anew the possibility of returning to church. All of those are fruitful in order, I think, to help her come to that decision, which she may very well come to at the end. And a lot of times you hear stories from priests of how dying family members say, no priest, no priest, no priest. And the priest shows up, they melt, and that's it. Grace is at work there. Take advantage of those opportunities. You don't want to make the person feel like you're forcing it on them, but at the other time you could be maybe a little bolder than you would be in normal circumstances.
And we certainly have reason to be hopeful here because the creator of the universe shared a very famous parable on this very subject with us when he talked about the various laborers coming in at various stages of work for a particular master.
That's right, because there is no obstacle to the restoration of grace. There is no obstacle to receiving, a person who lived a bad life and then makes a profound conversion is probably in a better state than they were before they started living their bad life, simply because of the fervor with which they make that return to the faith of the church. And we see it on Journey Home and in EWTN shows all the time. Lukewarm ex-Catholic leaves the church for something else, comes back as a zealous, full of life Catholic, prepared to win souls for Christ and to bring people to the church. That's a fairly typical story we hear at EWTN.
And it's important that those of us who maybe think we have stayed the course and led a moral life all the way through, we should embrace those moments and we should be happy for those people and we should hope they happen, shouldn't we? Sometimes we begrudge those situations.
And we do, and it's very easy within families to, I've never been able to influence my brother. I've never been able to influence my parents. You'd be surprised because, again, they're starting to think of how close that is, and God is at work in that moment, and trust in God and be not forceful, but maybe a little bit bolder with your relative.
How much have we really tried in the past?
That's also a good question to ask oneself. Have we really tried in the past? Sometimes inertia is just, they're not receptive. I'm going to leave it alone.
That's right. This is a very special mailbag edition of EWTN's Open Line Friday with our Vice President of Theology, Mr. Colin Donovan. He's answering your emails today, so no phone calls, please. We'll be back at it again on Monday with John Martinoni, and Colin will be back in taking live phone calls on next Friday. Open Line Friday rolls on with EWTN's Vice President of Theology, Mr. Colin Donovan.
This is Al Cresta, host of Cresta in the Afternoon, and Cresta in the Afternoon looks at all of life through the lens of Scripture and the teaching of the Catholic Church. Church teaching is the light by which we view the world, and so we'll explore everything, from abortion to Hollywood, and from the First Amendment to the United Nations, and everything in between. Following St. Paul, we're seeking transformation through the renewing of our minds. So that's Cresta in the Afternoon with me, Al Cresta, weekdays 4 to 6 p.m. Eastern on the EWTN Global Catholic Radio Network.
From the archives, this is the wisdom of Mother Angelica.
It's like the brides, 10 were very, very fervent, and they had oil in their lamp, and they had oil, extra oil. Here were 10 that they had oil in their lamps, but no extra oil. Here the bridegroom is coming, and those who had just the oil in their lamp all went out. They said, "Give me some of your oil." And they said, "Hey, we can't, lest we too run out." The first thought in your mind is, they're uncharitable. Why didn't they share? I know what you're thinking. I thought the same thing. But see, when we die, my friends, when the bridegroom calls you and me, there's no more time to get oil. You've had 5 years, 10 years, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, 80. You got to repent. You got to go ahead of time and put oil in that lamp.
For more about Mother Angelica, visit EWTNRC.com.
This is Patrick Coffin. Join me for Catholic Answers Live. It's 2 hours dedicated to Catholic apologetics and evangelization. Designed for Catholics and non-Catholics alike, it's your opportunity to hear from and talk with some of the leading apologists and theologians in the Church today. You've got questions? We've got Catholic Answers. Catholic Answers Live, weekdays 6 to 8 p.m. Eastern on the EWTN Global Catholic Radio Network.
Making a difference. EWTN Radio.
This is Open Line on the EWTN Global Catholic Radio Network. If you have a question or comment, call 1-800-585-9396. Outside North America, call 1-205-271-2985 or send an email to openline@ewtn.com.
Hey, if you missed the World Over Live with Raymond Arroyo last night, log on to www.ewtn.com to find encore times in your area. And be sure to tune in tonight to Life on the Rock, another great guest for Father Mark and Doug. Again, that'll be 8 Eastern tonight, EWTN Television. This is a very special mailbag edition of EWTN's Open Line Friday with our Vice President of Theology, Mr. Colin Donovan. Back to the mailbag we go. Susan writes, "We have a pastor who's very controlling. He announced this week that we should all receive the Eucharist on the hand. To me, this is the most offensive thing. I'm thinking of changing churches, but I realize this is my church, and he's supposed to be like Christ and not control everything. Does a pastor have the power to do this? I'm just devastated." And that's Susan.
Mm-hmm. No, he doesn't actually have the power. The option of how to receive is fully under the authority of the communicant. It is also apparently true, at least I've read this as a canonical opinion, that a priest who doesn't want to give communion in the hand, of course, isn't obliged to do that either. So it is in that sense, it's a two-way street. More traditional priests might not want to do that. Less traditional ones might want to force people to take communion in the hand. Sometimes they present what seem like reasonable arguments of cleanliness in that. I think most of those arguments have been refuted by anybody who looks at them. But simply as a matter of law, this question came up in a couple different respects about a decade ago. One as to whether a pastor could tell people they can't kneel to receive communion, and Rome said no. A pastor cannot force people to stand. It is normative in the United States, for example, but that doesn't exclude more devout ways of receiving, such as kneeling, and so people continue to do that, and that's according to Rome, who is the lawgiver and therefore the law interpreter. That is acceptable. And likewise, it is up to the communicant to determine whether they wish to receive in the traditional fashion on the tongue, or according to the indult for the United States, which is that you may, but may not be obliged to receive on the hand. So this is not within his authority. So, like you said, I think you made a good point. This is my parish. With charity and perseverance, resist such an effort. Speak to the pastor. He has a boss. Speak to the boss. He has a boss. This is all foreseen in the canon law, in the right of the faithful to appeal to their pastors that they receive their rights. And it is your right to receive on the tongue if you choose to, and therefore you can appeal all the way to Rome to have that right sustained as it will be. As it will be. And priests have been rebuked by Rome, sometimes over the head of their bishops historically, for refusing to give communion to those who are kneeling and trying to force people to receive in the hand. So this may not be a path that he wants you to go down on, but it's within your rights to do that.
Dan writes in, is modernism helping to hasten the times of the Antichrist? Modernism is the most dangerous of all heresies because it destroys any basis for belief in a supernatural world, whereas previous heresies had restricted themselves to denying one or more teachings of the Catholic faith. St. Pius X described modernism as, quote, the synthesis of all heresies, unquote, as it seeks to lay the axe not to the branches and shoots of the Catholic Church, but to the very root, that is, to the faith in its deepest fibers. And once they have struck the axe, they proceed to diffuse poison throughout the whole tree, so that there is no part of the Catholic truth which they have left untouched. Modernism poses a threat to our faith and hence to our hope of salvation, and that's Dan.
Yeah. I would say certainly is part of the problem, but a lot of things are. Remember, with regard to the Antichrist, basically we're the man of sin. We're looking forward to a time in the future, and I believe at some distance in the future, not around the corner. We're talking about an antinomian age, meaning that all moral norms are set aside. We see that today. But whereas in the late 19th century and early 20th century, you could have described modernism as a particular entity, sort of an attack on the philosophical roots of theology, Thomism and so on, an attack on the natural foundations of theology as well, which certainly includes philosophy and so on, and by a decided program in the seminaries and universities. I think what we have today is we have more of Hydraism, to coin a phrase, and that is we have a multi-headed monster that is coming at us from different directions, which have loose connections. And it is in that sense perhaps the terminal phase of modernism that in those parts of the church which have imbibed it, have imbibed the philosophical errors and the theological errors, we now have all this other stuff, the gender ideology, especially in the Catholic Church, in various places where the respect for the natural law, especially man and woman, and the role of man and woman in society, the role of man and woman in marriage, the role of man and woman in perpetuating the species. You could go down the line to even a disagreement over sexuality in general. It's almost as if there are some people who believe there are 7 billion people in the world. That means there must be 7 billion genders because they all get to decide what their gender is and give it some name. The list is into the 60s and 70s of names people have given to what they perceive themselves to be. And if you look online, you can find lists of these things which are really obscure self-identifications. So we have what was laid as a basis in some quarters of the church and unsuccessfully suppressed, as it were, by the efforts of Leo XIII in the revival of Thomism. We see the roots in which a false view of the person and existence and so on, the so-called existentialist question, has penetrated it so that you can have Catholics who are both, I'm a devout Catholic and I'm ardently pro-choice. How can that be? That's a false view of the person and of existence, that I get to decide whether the life of the unborn is worth living for them. So all these things are sort of reaching their terminus. I think that is something of an apocalyptic sign in itself, but I don't know that modernism per se, by the classical definition, is anything other than the substructure of the much more fervent cultural exemplars of it, perpetuated by Catholics and non-Catholics alike. So in the past, you sort of had this occult hidden movement of modernism percolating up in different places. Today, you have these boiling old, wide open ideologies of different kinds, including gender ideology, that are, I believe, today the mortal threat. Now, not that these other threats aren't there, but I think the more mortal threat, especially to living the life in the world and in society and families, comes directly from some of the fruits of the modernist idea, which severed philosophy and theology, and you can throw in Descartes and a few philosophers in helping to do that as well, severed it from reality, as Thomism, as St. Thomas clearly establishes it as a realist philosophy, severed that, and then severed theology from revelation, and even revelation from history, as if it's just mythology. So all of these things have worked together, but is sort of the lesser beast now, because the Hydra head has come up, and there's no reference to Captain America or any of those movies there, but it's not a bad image of what's going on.
I think it's a fantastic analogy, because it seems like every time you refute one of these heresies, two more come back in its place.
Another head pops up, or two, yes. Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah, so
we'll call it Hydra modernism for lack of another name.
Coined by Colin Donovan. You heard it here first. And by the way, that's our second reference this week to Pius XIII, or to Leo XIII.
A great pope, great writings. People ought to read them.
St. Michael prayer discussion the other day.
Good.
Jessica writes in, "Hello, I have a family member that has passed away. His wish was to have a Catholic funeral after cremation. He also wanted his ashes spread over a lake. His children are not Catholic, and so I had a priest explain to them that the ashes need to be kept together to honor the body. They decided to forego his wish for a Catholic funeral so they could scatter the ashes. They have invited us to this quote-unquote celebration, and I was wondering if my husband and I can attend such an event as Catholics."
I think that is not a good idea. Anytime you're being asked to defend something by your presence, really what you're doing, defending by your presence, affirming by your presence some action which is, contrary to the will of God, contrary to the mind of the church, it's best to give your polite apologies than to try to find some casuistic reason why you can go. There are probably reasons there. This is a close person I need to honor. But if the relatives did not honor his wish for a Catholic, the more important thing, they basically elevated the natural end of his ashes over the supernatural beginning of his eternal life, the Catholic funeral, and so they got their priorities inverted. That doesn't deserve your attention, I don't believe.
Wonderful. And we've got a question here from Robert. He says, "I'm just wondering why this office of quote-unquote irremovable pastors has been done away with, and why priests are regularly reassigned instead of tending a flock for a long period of time. It just seems disruptive."
I mean, that used to be the way, wasn't it? You see Bing Crosby and Going My Way, the old Irish priest there, he's been there forever, and he's going to be there until I carry him out.
It'll be all right.
It'll be all right. And you're going to carry me out of here. So, and I think they did at the end of that. So that was the old way. When the new Code of Canon Law, for whatever wisdom was at work, they put in the idea of, if you will, term limits, Each National Bishops' Conference can decide that in a certain way, but the idea that you could have a 6 or a 12-year term as pastor, I think 12 years is not uncommon, or a renewed 6 for 12. Different ways it's being done. But the idea was that it'd get priests a variety of experience, I believe. It's interesting, there has been something of a turn on that logic, because I remember that in the about a decade or so ago, there was a lot of discussion in Rome. I forget whether it was Cardinal Arinze or one of the other cardinals who favored it. Might even have been Pope Benedict. The idea that bishops, at least, should, as much as possible, stay in one place. The difficulty is the practicality. We, if you will, we stole our bishop from Charleston. Well, glad we did. Poor Charleston. They have a great bishop now, of course, but, bishops need to get experience too. And the ones who are archbishops don't usually get to be archbishops by going from, father and monsignor. They get to have a period of probation, if you will, in a smaller diocese as just the bishop of a small diocese. So, yes, as an ideal, this idea of a life, the rest of one's time being pastor of the people of this particular place, whether as pastors or as bishops, is a great ideal, but there are practical reasons why it seldom seems to work out that way.
Colin, we had a question earlier in the week. I think it was actually towards the end of last week. They were asking about frequently, prior to the recent translation update of the Mass, of the canon of the Mass, you would hear a priest, and it was a common thing, you would see it from place to place, where you would hear a priest just before he received the Eucharist, he would say, "May the body and blood of Christ bring us to everlasting life." Mm-hmm. And the way the question was worded is, why has that been eliminated from the new translation? And I talked to a couple priests and briefly gave the answer that I speculated at the time that it wasn't actually in the sacramentary, but they just added that. But apparently it actually was. But it's one of the silent prayers that the priest was to say to himself. And in the new translation, it has actually been replaced by two prayers, one to be said just prior to receiving the host, and one to be said just prior to receiving the chalice. Do you want to confirm or deny or elaborate on that a little bit for that listener that may be
I had never done the structural comparison of the old or the new, but there has always been, in the reform of Vatican II, one of the things that was intended was that the private prayers of the priest that have always been in the missal, obviously the priest, if he hasn't got to memorize it, needs to have something to see to say that prayer. But they were always in the missal. They're usually in a smaller print. It was clear.
Italicized.
Exactly, so that, they would say this prayer. We have the situation, of course, today that most priests are mic'd or the altar's mic'd, and so the people are familiar with hearing that. But in reality, they were always meant to be the prayer of the priest, his own private preparation for communion, which often then became public. So I think it sounds like the explanation you got is consistent with the idea of emphasizing the privateness of it rather than, the laity have always heard me say this, and so I'm going to say it loud enough for them to hear. That was never the idea, but it practically in our situation has
and it's
become.
happened throughout the Mass in various places.
There are other
you'll hear
places.
The prayers at the lavabo and other places that some priests will say a little louder than other priests.
Some will make a performance of it, yes, but no, it was never the intention of the Church or even of the rubrics in the Missal, the red writing giving directions in the Missal itself.
A hot topic this past Monday on Open Line Monday with John Martinoni was the posture of the faithful during the Our Father at Mass. Mm-hmm. And that really is not addressed at all in the rubrics, in the general instruction of the Roman Missal. It's not, and most of our callers were a little disconcerted by the Oran's position, even more so by holding hands. And I think it might be prudent if you would give us a little treatise on posture during the Our Father.
I can treatise. When need be, I can treatise. Well, we have to start with the idea the Mass is a sacramental sign. The whole thing of it. A great liturgical theologian named Cyprian Valgagini, a Benedictine who wrote in the 50s, called it a complexus of signs. In other words, we think of the 7 sacraments, but the whole liturgy is a sign in which the priest is distinctive because he represents Christ the head. So he has presiding or the actions that are done in persona Christi or by virtue of being a sign of Christ the head of the Church. The laity come as members of the church, and the different elements, whether it's the incense, the candles, the structure of the church, all of these are saying something about our supernatural belief, about God, the nature of the sacraments, the nature of the church, and other things in our faith. So when you get down to the postures in the Mass, the purpose of the postures is to show a unity with the priest. So there are parts where we certainly pray as a whole. The Our Father is one of those. But there are parts where the priest as presider is doing the praying, and we're even sitting down or kneeling in the case of the Eucharistic prayer. And it says something about the distinction of offices between the people and the deacons, for that matter, and the priest and any concelebrants. So if you look at it, okay, what is going on here with the signs? In the 1970s, there was a slightly different thing that was popular, and that is that as a sign, I'm trying to think of the exact thing now. It's been a while since I've read the text, but there was a holding of hands as the kiss of peace. There was not the exchange of the handshake, but in some places they were simply holding hands as that sign. And a bishop submitted this to Rome and got back an interpretation of the rubrics, which basically said this, that in the Mass, the sign of intimacy with God and with neighbor is the communion. That's why the ideal of everybody going to communion is present, everybody who's morally capable of it, okay? They're in their moral state. So that to introduce other signs of personal intimacy, especially if they're merely human signs, displaces and could even contradict that principal sign, which is the communion of the priest and of the faithful, by which we are united to Christ, and in that bond of charity we're united to each other. So if holding hands at the kiss of peace, and then it also added that the fraternal gesture of an actual kiss of peace, as you see the Pope and priests doing at the altar, or of the handshake, as our Bishops' Conference has established for the United States, that this sign of reconciliation is a fraternal gesture and doesn't conflict, obviously, with the communion. But if you have at the Our Father, and that you have everybody holding hands, then it somewhat displaces. And you've seen in parishes how that almost becomes the phenomenological high point of the Mass, that holding of hands and that greeting of all my friends and buddies in the church and the elevation and all of that. So this was the reason it was forbidden for the kiss of peace, and the very same logic applies to the Our Father. Also, it displaces the sign. I mean, do you hold hands with your wife and say, well, goodbye, honey, I'm going to work and extend? It doesn't make any logical sense to have a sign of reconciliation or something following such an intimate sign as holding hands. What's the logical sense of it? So there's another illogic to it. So this has been, I think, the attitude of Rome is expressed in those answers. And I think clearly the practice at least of holding hands, is refuted. Now, our Bishops' Conference, in a pastoral guide for the Mass, after the new translation came out 2002-ish, did suggest the Orans position and what makes that possible. And in Italy and some other countries, they also have this permission. The Orans position, at least, is my posture. My posture may be hands in my pocket, it could be hands on my hip, it could be hands clasped at my breast, it could be a very devout posture, it could be hands like this. That at least would seem to fall within the possible gestures during the Our Father. The holding hands across the aisle and all of the hullabaloo that typically goes with it at the sign of peace afterwards is clearly not the mind of the Church and clearly contrary to the rubrics. The Orans position, at least, because Rome has approved it in some places, is justifiable. It's not obligatory, however. But the Bishops' Conference did recommend it as a possible way of, and I remember in the 90s when the Bishops' Conference were talking about it at their annual meeting. It was a question of not upsetting the apple cart and of doing something that would sort of displace these other practices. It just hasn't happened. They have not been displaced.
Now, at the end of the day, is this at the discretion of the local ordinary to a certain extent?
I think it's like a lot of things. Yes, that can be, proposed, and it can't be, I don't think, necessarily enforced, because the laity have no strong direction on how they're to hold their hands during the Mass. So I don't think that is overridden by the proposal. If the Bishops' Conference proposes it, I don't think that necessarily means a bishop can impose it.
Why would it not be in the germ? That's a question that you hear from a lot of people.
Because it's in this other document, and I don't believe the other document needed Roman approval, to be honest. I could be wrong about that, and so I don't want to.
Well, I had and I don't know how far off the beaten path this is, but I had a liturgist, a diocesan liturgist, not an ordained person, but a diocesan educated liturgist, had said that the bishops sent a request to Rome for the holding of the hands and received no response. And
that's a no in ordinary Roman lingo.
And that's not how they interpreted it.
Yeah.
They interpreted it as not a no.
Well, the holding of the hands, yes. The orans, I think, because Rome has granted that indult elsewhere, you can, It's sort of like the recent thing over the washing of feet of other than men. Rome had granted those indults, so even back on John Paul's day, perceived the possibility but did not grant the wide legal right to do it, and now this Pope has.
Well, Colin, thanks so much for emptying out that mailbag. My shoulder feels much better already from lugging that thing around. But I'm sure we've had a wonderful day at the Shrine on our retreat, and we certainly hope that all of our viewers and listeners have a beautiful Lenten season. Give us 30 seconds on how to prepare for a great Lent or how to continue a great Lent, maybe if you haven't started. So
we'll get to Ash Wednesday.
That's passed.
That's passed. So that's over with. So get to confession and make it a good Lent. That's the best way to start out. And more frequent Mass if you're able.
On behalf of our host, Colin Donovan, producer Elena Rodriguez, call screener for that one phone call we took, Mr. Matt Kubensky, I'm Jack Williams. Have a tremendous Lent. We'll be back at it again on Monday with John Martinoni. Until we get together then, God bless.